there is a very important component is how do we understand the human factors, problems like physiology, respiratory physiology, metabolism, and also the cognitive functions, physical efficiency. How does it change at high altitude so that we are able to keep the soldiers fighting fit? We lost the Chinese aggression in 1962 because we didn't know how to fight a war at high altitude. We were ignorant. So that is the time when all our clinicians, researchers, physiologists, and medical specialists worked together, including people from here and the icon, Dr. V.R. Vishwanathan, Professor Painter, and we had people from Guleria, from All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and we had also Sujay Roy, and so we had a number of people who immediately came to, along with Jalinder Singh, Brigadier N.D. Menon. So they all worked together to understand how do we deploy our troops at high altitude, because we didn't know at that time to fight a war at high altitude. So the one reason why this research is important is that we are deploying and turning over a large volume of troops. Every 2 years they have to be turned over. So that's a big challenge. Then the second aspect is now a number of civilian people are sojourning high altitude. If you look at the people going to Amarnath cave and people going to the Kedarnath, so all these caves and pilgrimage is now demanding special attention, because the civilian people who are not regimented to be acclimatizing to those high altitudes, they have to be moving there. So the sojourn to high altitude by the civilian is a big challenge. Not only that, mountaineers going to venturing into Everest and also higher pinnacles of the Himalayas. So again, it's a big challenge. How do we give them the input, the research input, to make that assault successful? So we have mountaineers, we have trekkers, we have tourists going to high altitude every year. The number is increasing every year. So this is another dimension of civilian people sojourning high altitude for occupational reasons and also for sports, adventures and pilgrimage. Then we have native population living there. If you see the whole Himalayan belt, and also in other countries, we have Pikes Peak, Peru. We have a number of places where people live up to 4,300 meters altitude. That's a quite a big altitude. So native people live there. So how do we also look after the health of the native people who are living there? So the other importance. The last part is, which is important, that we can learn quite a bit about clinical hypoxia, how it affects the patients, be it a cardiac related, respiratory related, metabolic related hypoxia. You learn quite a lot of lessons from those research which you carry out at high altitude. So that is why the high altitude research is important. And in fact, ICMR and Dr. Ganguly was there. They were planning to develop an advanced center in high altitude medicine in the DRDO laboratory, DPAS. Now we have established a high altitude medical research center at Leh, which is one of the best centers at that high altitude in 153 GH. So we have certain landmark achievements in the country, but we need to do more. So what is that we need to do more? What we have been able to accomplish in this field? I'm not going to cover the whole spectrum of respiratory research, but I'm going to give a tip of the pinnacle, tip of the iceberg. I'm going to project to you in my presentation only on the respiratory challenges at high altitude, where what we have contributed, particularly from DRDO and also some other institutions, and where I have personally contributed. That's what is going to be the presentation. The icon in the respiratory medicine and the father of respiratory medicine here in our country, Professor R. Vishwanathan, my tributes to him and my salutations to this great soul who have really not only founded this great institution but made a mark. If somebody has read his book on tuberculosis, he has done a wonderful contribution, and his biography is yet another important contribution where youngsters should read this. It's a personality. It's easy to admire but difficult to emulate. That's the kind of personality Professor Vishwanathan. And I had a brief interaction with him because he used to drive the vehicle himself. He said, I won't have a driver, whether as a director or a very senior professor. Till very late in the age, he was driving himself in terms of coming to the lab, working here. So I don't want to be driven, but I want to drive myself. So that is the kind of the zeal and enthusiasm at that age he had. So we should emulate some of those personalities, the qualities. So my salutation to this soul, and I consider this as a great honor to be here in this great institution to deliver the 15th oration in memory of Professor Raman Vishwanathan. High altitude is very beautiful to look at. If you really see the mountains, snow-clad mountains, and also look at the skiing spots, it is beautiful. You will admire them if you are going there for a couple of days or maybe for a week. But if you stay there in high altitude, it's a great challenge because you have hypoxia. As you go up in high altitude, there is a partial pressure of oxygen decreases, you get into hypoxia. It's one of the primary stressors at altitude. The second major stress is cold due to adiabatic expansion of the gases. Then you have also the cold. As you ascend up in altitude, the cold is a major stress as well. Then you have radiation, solar radiation, and also blizzards at times. So you have a number of challenges besides the psychological challenges, which is isolation, monotony, separation from family, fear of the unknown for the soldier who has to sit across where the shells coming from the other side. So you can see the physical, physiological and psychological stress is impinging on the soldier who is sitting there at high altitude. Besides many other physiological responses due to that stress. So you have decline in physical efficiency is understood because you have hypoxia of severe degree as you go up above 4,000 meters. The hypoxic stress is quite huge, and so you have the problems in decline in physical and cognitive ability of the individuals, concentration, memory, learning efficiency, eye-hand coordination, psychomotor performance, decision making, vigilance, all this gets affected at high altitude. So you have both physical and mental or cognitive ability decline at high altitude due to hypoxia primarily. Then you have also certain maladies which we encounter, like acute mountain sickness, pulmonary edema, cerebral edema, also cold injuries, hypothermia, and pulmonary hypertension. So these are some of the major problems. If you stay there for a long time, you would encounter. How does the system for youngsters, how does the system, very simple to understand the physiology of acclimatization to high altitude. The first thing which comes into the rescue of a human being who goes to high altitude is respiration. The whole ventilation goes up. The ventilation, there is hyperventilation through the chemoreceptors, and he starts, both the rate as well as the depth starts increasing, so he starts hyperventilating through the chemoreceptors. The first response. Then you need diffusion across the respiratory membrane. So your oxygen which has gone into the alveoli have to come into the blood. Then you need to combine, load that into the hemoglobin. So you need the number. So the red blood cells increases, erythropoietin comes in, and polycythemia, and you have the transportation mechanism is improved, and the binding is better, loading is better, and then it goes by faster heart rate. So sympathetic and sympathotadrenal mediated heart rate tachycardia happens. So the supply per unit time is increased. So the next response is to supply it faster. So heart rate goes up, and cardiac output may not change much, but certainly it augments the flow per unit time. Then at the delivery at the tissue level, you need 2,3 DPG, diphosphoglycerate, to offload from the hemoglobin into the tissue. So that is the next step. Then in the long-term acclimatization, effective and economical utilization of this oxygen which has been delivered to the tissue at the cytochrome level, mitochondrial level. So simple, the process of respiratory adaptation is very simple to understand. That's what happens at high altitude. So you have the hyperventilation. So can we measure the susceptibility of a person to high altitude illness just by measuring the respiratory response in a simulated hypoxic ventilatory drive? You can do that by a closed circuit breathing and monitor the end-tidal PO2, and then keep recording the ventilatory response, how does it go up. So you can measure the hypoxic ventilatory drive, which is a very good indicator of the adaptability of a person to high altitude. So this you can actually use it as a predictability test. Then because of this hyperventilation, you have hypocapnia, because you wash out CO2 and then that leads to respiratory alkalosis. This respiratory alkalosis at the initial stages till the renal compensation comes in and also metabolic acidosis sets in. It's a big challenge to handle that respiratory alkalosis. So many of the acute mountain sickness and the initial stages of the maladaptation syndromes, symptoms you observe is primarily due to those respiratory alkalosis. So you have the oxygen uptake going up because of the increased ventilation. CO2 output, that is you get into the washout of CO2 and then getting into acid-base balance shift leading to alkalosis. And then even on return to the lower altitude on sojourn for a long time, the hyperventilation, it returns to the sea level after some time. Then this is very important, that how does the oxygen dissociation curve, where you have end-tidal PO2, then you have the saturation of hemoglobin. So this curve is very important because I am going to discuss more about this. So where you find as soon as the PO2 goes below about 85 millimeters mercury, then you come in the steep part of the curve. So even during sleep, that was my PhD thesis in Delhi University, sleep behavior at high altitude, where we found this is very important. And also the respiratory abnormal, the periodic breathing which you get at the initial phase of high altitude is also because of the respiratory alkalosis hypocapnia, which has a dampening effect on the ascending reticular activating system. So that dampens it, and ultimately that leads to the synchronization of the EEG, as well as you get all the symptoms of sleep disturbance. Yes. So now the next thing I want to show that how the oxygen saturation goes down. So even with hyperventilation, the oxygen saturation is very low, but you are already on the steep part of the curve. So during deep sleep, when you go into non-REM sleep, like stage 3 and 4 of the non-REM sleep, that's the phase when there is hypoventilation. Your hyperventilation is eliminated and the individual goes into hypoventilation, thereby accentuating the hypoxemia which already exists. He is already on the steep part of the curve, and any further fall in saturation will happen because of the hypoventilation in deep sleep. So the body immediately wakes him up through respiratory mechanism, that is through the chemoreceptors, and then information goes to ascending reticular formation, and then ultimately the individual is woken up, cortical arousal, when he starts hyperventilating again. So the disturbed sleep, intermittent disturbed sleep at high altitude is a protective mechanism to see an individual not getting into accentuated hypoxemia. So that is what we found in that particular study which I published in an international journal. And then this is the saturation. Then we used to use acetazolamide as a prophylactic. As soon as the person lands in the airfield at Leh, particularly for air inductees, they were given immediately this diuretic. This diuretic is not only getting rid of the effective circulating blood volume to be lowered by the diuresis, but it also does another important thing, the carbonic anhydrase inhibitor. That's a very important thing it does. So we were using it at a particular dose, but then now it has been stopped because some people who naturally adapt, naturally acclimatize, and also who compensate by diuresis to reduce the effective circulating blood volume by the diuresis, the normal hormonal mechanisms of ADH and aldosterone. So now we found that this particular thing is not required. Only the people who show severe degree of symptoms of acute mountain sickness or early onset of high altitude pulmonary edema, now it is being prescribed. So it's no more used as prophylactic. But in a historical perspective, we did try this as a prophylactic. Then I also reported the studies on EEG. How does the brain, the central nervous system, respond to this respiratory alkalosis and also the hypocapnia? So you have two factors. I carried out in 76 my paper published an autonomic nervous system. How does the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic activity change at high altitude in the people who sojourn and also natives of high altitude? So there are two factors. As you go up, sympathetic overactivity happens and sympathoadrenal activity goes up naturally as a stress, high altitude stress. But there is an opposite force which is the hypocapnia and respiratory alkalosis. It has two different imbalanced activity on the central nervous system. The desynchronization will be produced by sympathetic overactivity. Hypocapnia, through the dampening effect on the ascending reticular activating system, it will produce synchronization. So you will find at the initial stages of second and third day of induction, you will find that there is a lot of synchronized EEG pattern. But by about 7th day, the cortical neurons adapt to low PCO2, and then by the time sympathetic activity reaching the peak and remaining there, and you will see the desynchronization pattern in the EEG. Then we also tried whether we can improve this by practice of pranayama, the breathing exercises. So we had two groups of soldiers, one group doing yoga, the other group doing the routines of the physical training program. How do they adapt respiration? We did many other parameters. I am just showing only the respiration part of it. So you'll find the group which was doing yoga after 1 month and 2 months as compared to the controls who did not do the physical training program, we found also the FBC and the FEV1 as well as the peak flow rate, all this was much better in this group who practiced yoga. Then we also looked at other parameters like SpO2. You find a significant improvement as compared to the controls. So these were certain things which we did. Now yoga is introduced. We looked at the prophylactic, promotive and curative potentials of yoga for the soldiers at high altitude. Now yoga is a regular part of the training at 14 Corps in the Western sector. We train the trainers from Morarji Deshna National Institute of Yoga. The instructors go through DIPAS, Defense Institute of Physiology and Allied Sciences. So they are trained there, all the people, and these trainers go to the units and train the soldiers. Because there is a turnover every 2 years they move. So we train those trainers, and then ultimately trainers go to the unit and train the other people. So yoga is introduced based on physiological, biochemical, psychological and clinical studies which we carried out at DIPAS in DRDO, and ultimately these have been introduced into as a training curriculum. So always our research in DRDO, as was mentioned by Professor Katoch as well as Professor Tendon, that we aim at an end result. We don't look at publication is an offshoot or a byproduct, but our aim is to solve a problem. There is a problem and you need to give a solution. It could be a product, it could be a system, it could be a technology, it could be a process, it could be a protocol of treatment. So we look at that end part. So I think all our research culture in the laboratory, in our laboratories, be it in ICMR or DRDO or CSIR or Patel Chest, we need to look at bring that culture. It should be a directed basic research or directed clinical research or directed towards an ultimate goal which should be translated into an application. So we always look at that. So we introduce yoga, ultimately having done that research. Then the present challenge is, if we have to deploy both on the eastern side and western side simultaneously the soldiers and fight a war in two fronts, how do we handle this? So, and the soldiers we need to deploy with no acclimatization or with minimal acclimatization. So we were looking at rapid induction to high altitude. How do we fight a war? So first is, can we pre-acclimatize soldiers at plains itself before they are taken to altitude? So we created intermittent hypoxic exposure chambers. You can put 25 people, 30 people at a stretch and then expose them intermittently 6 hours a day. And then it is not just chambers, it is just rooms have been constructed with hypoxic simulated decompression chambers have been created. So if you do that, they are already pre-acclimatized to high altitude. The other one is at moderate high altitude, like 7,000 feet, 6,000 feet. You keep the soldiers with high physical activity. When you give physical activity at moderate altitude, then the demand for oxygen goes up. So you are physiologically simulating hypoxia within the system. So the system gets acclimatized to high altitude. So we keep troops at moderate altitude with high physical endurance exercises, and so that they are now adapted to altitude physiologically. Then we have also tried chemical hypoxia by cobalt chloride. We have done animal experiments, we have not gone into humans, that this also can produce chemical hypoxia. So we have done all this to keep the pre-acclimatized soldiers who can be immediately uplifted, airlifted to high altitude. The other way is, can we make him to fight with oxygen, so that he fights during daytime with oxygen and then he sleeps in oxygen enriched environments. So this is also we have created, you can see them when you go today. So these are very composite cylinders, so that the cylinder should not be heavy when he is carrying ammunition, food, survival kit, everything. So we have developed lightweight oxygen cylinders. Then we have given the delivery on demand, that is, You just open the cylinder, oxygen doesn't flow. Only when he demands oxygen, the valve opens, and so you are economically utilizing that oxygen from the cylinder. So it lasts for a long time. So we have developed those oxygen delivery masks as well as the delivery valve, which will close, open on demand and close on expiration. So we developed those systems, and ultimately we developed oxygen generators at high altitude on a large scale. So because when you have to enrich this whole hall with oxygen, you need the rate of production has to be very high. So we have developed those oxygen generators, put in 153GH, and also Air Force Station in Leh. You will find also in Patna sector, we have put oxygen enriched chambers. So we developed those oxygen generators, large scale oxygen generators. Then we also carried out studies in the field. So we have soldiers who can fight with oxygen cylinder, and we developed those systems. Then these are some small chambers which is enriched with oxygen. At night, if they have to sleep, if they have time to sleep, they get into this oxygen rich so that they don't get into sleep problems, as well as like you have interrupted sleep disturbance, as well as you have problems related to cognitive decline due to sleep deprivation. All that is avoided. So we make them sleep in oxygen enriched chambers as well as the rooms. So we created rooms like hypoxic room to simulate hypoxia, intermittent hypoxia, and we also could produce the altitude chamber. We have this, and also we have produced a small enclosures where you can create the oxygen enrichment. Then we also looked at cobalt chloride, as I mentioned, the chemical hypoxia for intermittent hypoxic exposure like what we gave. We also gave chemical hypoxia by which you can pre-acclimatize before a soldier is taken to high altitude. Then with all this, we still land up in problems, acute mountain sickness, where you have headache, nausea, vomiting, pallor, sleep disturbance, and anorexia, and all these are symptoms of acute mountain sickness. But the more important problem, which is worrying, is the high altitude pulmonary edema, where the water comes out, the fluid comes out of the pulmonary vessels and get into the alveoli and becomes a barrier for oxygen diffusion. As it is, there is hypoxemia. As it is, there is hypoxia. And then if you put another film of fluid, alveolar, the exudates, which have come out of the vascular bed, then that's going to be a barrier for diffusion of oxygen. So there will be a greater accentuation of hypoxemia. Patient may die. So what we have done in this area, and these are all very well known. We have dyspnea. These are symptoms by which you can diagnose a head patient. But there will be a non-uniform patchy edema. If you look at the X-rays, chest X-rays, you will find a patchy edema. I'll show some pictures there. And in fact, Professor R. Vishwanathan contributed to this area. He showed there's a non-uniform vasoconstriction. The vasoconstriction of the pulmonary arterial bed is not uniform. There's a, why it is patchy? One is non-uniform vasoconstriction and vasodilatation as well. Then you also have perfusion ventilation mismatch. There's another big problem which happens because of this patchy edema. So these are some of the things, the clinical features. You'll find cyanosis in severe case, find tachycardia, tachypnea, all these are well known to the pulmonologists and respiratory medicine people like you. How does it happen? What is the pathophysiology in which your institution has contributed quite a bit to the pathophysiology of high altitude pulmonary edema? Hypoxia, what it does, it causes pulmonary vasoconstriction through the alpha receptors, sympathetic receptors, which is available in the pulmonary vascular bed, and then that produces vasoconstriction. The pulmonary vascular resistance goes up, hydrostatic pressure increases, capillary permeability increases. You see the capillary permeability increases. So you have now a good small molecular proteins like albumin leaks into the interstitium. Now because the osmotic pressure has gone up in interstitium, it sucks more water into interstitium. Then J receptors come into play, Professor Painter's J receptors come into play,